What's up, YouTube? Welcome back. It is a gloomy day here in Florida, and I am on my way down to the spring's edge to check out the conditions. And sadly, it's about as bad as I remember from a couple years ago. So, through my videos, I like to capture a lot of the beauty that exists in these aquatic environments that not everyone gets to see all the time. I like to do that wherever I am, whether that's Florida or somewhere else in the US, or maybe one day if the channel gets big enough overseas somewhere. But the reality is that a lot of these environments, and especially the freshwater ones like Florida Springs, are facing a growing number of threats and challenges. And that's true of this spring in particular. Now, we're still going to see a lot of wildlife, but this spring is suffering, and that'll be pretty evident when we get underwater. My hope is that these places can last forever, and I think it's important that even as we admire what beauty still exists out there, we have to learn about what threats these places face if we want them to stick around in the future. I'm gonna go get suited up. Hope you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you out there. I know that some people like using defog or anti-fog in their masks, but for some reason my saliva works really well. So figure if it ain't broke, don't fix it. As I approached the entry stairs, and before I even had a chance to put my fins on and get underwater, I could already see big strands of algae swaying in the flow of the spring. This wasn't a good sign. I jumped in and was greeted by a rather empty and boring looking aquascape. Fortunately, a curious school of striped mullets swam right by me. These fish can tolerate a wide range of salinity or salt levels. You can find them in the ocean, brackish water, and even freshwater springs like this one. I watched them for a while, and occasionally they would swim down to the bottom, scoop up a mouthful of dirt and algae, and then spit it out as they continued on their way. This is called benthic feeding, and they're just filtering out microorganisms and tiny bits of algae to eat. After watching the mullet for a bit, I headed upstream towards the Headspring. In addition to a thin coating of algae along the bottom, there were tufts of it that stuck up randomly and swayed about in the current. I reached a deeper section of the spring where a large diving platform had been built. A few turtles were in the area, and I followed them underneath the platform. The supports of the structure were also covered in algae, but I thought I noticed a distinct shape on one of the pillars. Sure enough, an armored catfish, sometimes better known as a pleco, was using its suction cup-like mouth to hang on to the side. These fish are an invasive species here in Florida and were introduced by the pet trade. They are native to the Amazon River and don't belong in Florida at all, and are troublemakers in Florida Springs, harassing manatees and overpopulating. These fish do eat algae, but the springs aren't supposed to have this much algae to begin with, so unfortunately they have adapted readily to 6 springs and continue to spread throughout the state. They're called armored catfish for good reason, and are one of the most rock-solid fish I've ever encountered. If you ever get a chance to pick one up, you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. I watched as another river cooter sailed past me down the run, but I turned and began the final stretch up to the Headspring. This spring has a lot of infrastructure set up around it. It was bizarre looking down the run, and instead of seeing cypress knees and plants along the banks, there was just an endless concrete wall. It was like swimming down an empty city street lined with oppressive-looking office buildings. This might be kind of weird, but it made me think of the brutalism architectural style. It was kind of depressing. However, I know that this spring likely wouldn't exist without all this intense amount of infrastructure. Erosion would likely have filled in the spring from all the traffic that it sees on hot summer days. I get the feeling that this place was meant to be a secret swimming hole deep in the woods, but over the course of a century and a mostly noble attempt to allow more people to enjoy its beauty, it's become something strange and unrecognizable from its former glory. I can only imagine what that looked like, but now there's just so much concrete. I reached the headspring and looked down. There are 2 cracks in the limestone where the water flowed up from the aquifer. A group of juvenile gar were swimming about overhead. I watched them as they circled around me. I usually see adults, so I was pretty excited to see the mini version of these awesome fish. There are even a few hanging out in the algae on the bottom of the spring, and I was able to get a close-up shot of one of them. They're such a fragile-looking fish, but man, they really do grow up to be big and strong, and I've seen others in springs that are up to 4 to 5 feet. A bowfin suddenly appeared in front of me, and even came to check out my camera. These fish are ancient, and they're the only surviving species from the family Amidae, and really haven't changed all that much since the Cretaceous period. Bowfin have a long dorsal fin that runs the whole length of their body, and it's pretty mesmerizing to watch it flow in rhythmic motion as they swim about. There are a few more turtles in the headspring. The turtles will eat some of the algae if they have to, but it's not a very good food source compared to the vegetation that should naturally occur in these springs. I took a deep breath and dove down into one side of the vent of the spring. As I reached the bottom, about 20 feet down, I could see the 2 sides actually connected. I have a personal rule to never freedive overhead environments when I'm going solo, so even though I could have easily swam through, it's never worth the risk, so I just looked around in the dark, wet hole and then headed back up to the surface. The remains of an old cypress tree marked the headspring. I wondered how it died. I would bet that 100 years ago there were cypress trees all along the bank. A couple nice bass swim by me as I looked at the big old stump. There was an alarming amount of algae in the headspring. It was thick and deep along the bottom, so I sunk down into it to see just how much there was. It was more than a foot thick in some places. Even though it felt soft and really is a pretty interesting organism, it just kind of made me sick. It doesn't belong in this spring. Not like this. I made my way back to the diving platform and looked at another stump of an old cypress tree. I'm sure it was once a stunning tree, but water quality, encroaching infrastructure, and probably some wear and tear from swimmers over the years likely have all contributed to its demise. I happened to glance down toward my flippers and a small shape caught my eye. As I inspected closer, it shot off, leaving a puff of sand and algae behind it. I found another similar shape not far off and slowly got closer with my camera. It was a hog choker. Hog chokers are a type of sole, which is a type of flatfish. Apparently fishermen used to discard these fish on the beach since they were too bony to eat, and feral pigs would pick them up and gag on them, hence the weird name. Like all flatfish, their eyes start on opposite sides of their head, but then migrates so they can do what flatfish do and have both eyeballs up on one side. But it gets even crazier. These little fish are juveniles that have traveled all the way from saltwater when they were born to this spring. That's about 40 miles upriver for this particular spring. As they mature, they'll head back to saltwater where they'll reach full size at about 6 inches. These tiny camouflaged weirdos are just full of surprises. Hogchokers will always be cool to me, and it's a pleasant find amidst the algae that's strewn along the bottom of the spring. Check this out. It's just all over the spring. All this filamentous algae that's looks like kind of black right now, but under the water it's just green, endless seas of it. The thing about springs is they're actually low nutrient environments. I know those photos have like plenty of plants in them and you think like, oh, there probably are lots of nutrients for them to grow, but they're not. Those plants can thrive in low nutrient environments. But when nutrients are introduced to the system, and a lot of times that's through agricultural runoff, fertilizer, algae can grow in it no problem. And when algae takes a hold and there's an abundance of nutrients for the algae, it just explodes. It chokes out all the native vegetation in the spring. And I mean, you could see in my shots, like there's just no room for it at all. We're gonna cut to some shots I've taken in springs that are healthy, that actually have abundant vegetation. And it's just, the difference is crazy. But yeah, this stuff is gross, not good. Not what you want to be finding in healthy springs. And just how much is in here and how there's nothing else, like just really shows the spring really is suffering and slowly dying. I dove back into the green water and headed downstream towards where the river meets the spring. Some curious sunfish came out to greet me as I rounded a corner and came upon an underwater snag that was totally cloaked in algae. There were a ton of fish of all sizes hiding in the ghostly looking branches. Again, you see all this life in the spring and you might think, wow, I guess everything's okay. But it's not. The idea of shifting baselines is really important. If you only visited this spring and saw how many living things were in here, you might be tempted to think, well, I guess all springs look like that. This moves the baseline of a healthy spring to what we're familiar with and know, rather than what it historically should be and what the ecosystem needs it to be. Imagine how much more native wildlife would be here if the spring was healthy. We sometimes forget how interconnected freshwater is. It doesn't just sit in lakes and ponds and flow through rivers and streams, it also flows literally through the dirt. Unfortunately, whatever is dumped on the ground leaches into the soil, and when it rains on the farmland that surrounds this spring, all the excess fertilizer and animal waste gets into the groundwater and then flows back out of the springs. Now, this isn't to take a pot shot at agriculture. It's a challenging and important way of life, especially here in Florida, but it is the primary polluter of Florida springs. The solution should be for local, state, and federal government to work with agricultural producers to help limit the nitrogen pollution occurring on their land. But unfortunately, since groundwater is really out of sight, out of mind, it just doesn't get prioritized. It's important for us to speak up for these places, though, and work together to find innovative solutions to limit our impact on these aquatic systems. This is also ultimately our drinking water, and it's kind of scary that it looks like this when it comes out of the ground. I mean, this spring here literally looks like a hairy butt. How gross is that? In the distance, I saw some impressively large fish. These are grass carp. They're native to Russia, not Florida, but are purposely introduced to eat non-native vegetation that tends to choke out waterways. People have really mixed feelings about them, but it's kind of just another example of how bizarre and unhealthy this ecosystem is. As I continued downstream, I poked around to see what was hiding beneath the flowing strands of algae. A loggerhead musk turtle kept a watchful eye on me as I approached. Remember, this is a fully grown adult turtle. It's not a baby snapping turtle. A different species, the common musk turtle, was not too far off. Again, this is also a full-grown turtle too. They don't get very big either. I was really excited when this absolutely wild-looking face poked out of the green. This is a Florida softshell turtle. They're incredibly fast swimmers and are actually very good at burying themselves no matter what is on the bottom of a spring. He didn't stick around though and quickly sucked back into the algae and disappeared. As I reached the river, its brown tannic waters creeped in below the clearer spring water and made for an interesting sight. Some decent-sized bass were hanging out amongst the cypress knees. And another armored catfish was hanging out at the edge too. Couldn't help but think about how, if this spring is dying, what impact is it having on the river and all the downstream aquatic habitats? If you protect freshwater cycles and systems, you can preserve an impressive amount of habitat. But sadly, it's also true that if you pollute a single freshwater source, you can potentially harm every downstream habitat. Water connects all of life together, and we have to take protecting it seriously. As I reached the stairs to get out, the brilliant flash of red and blue of a bluefin killifish caught my eye as it swam up and down the steps. There you have it, folks. Not the most beautiful spot in the world, but you know, still saw a lot of wildlife, still worth checking out, but it just breaks my heart to see how sick that spring is. It might take a really long time for the spring to be able to fully heal and get back to what it's really supposed to look like. That doesn't only require changes around the immediate site of the spring, but also, you know, miles and miles upstream, the surrounding landscape, because like I said before, water connects everything. We gotta protect it. Thank you guys for enduring that one with me. Still cool things to see in there, but when you know the overall story of what the spring is supposed to be and what it sadly is, yeah, it's just sad. But I'm gonna get all this stuff off of me and go home and take a shower. So, thanks for watching. What's happening? And I'll see you in the next video.